Picture a woman stepping into the plush, wood-paneled office of a New York banker. She carries herself with an air of unshakable confidence, her gown whispering of old money and her eyes holding a secret. With nothing but sheer audacity and a carefully crafted story, she would convince some of the most powerful and cautious men in America to hand over fortunes, all based on a single, breathtaking lie. She claimed to be the secret, illegitimate daughter of the richest man in the world, Andrew Carnegie. This is not a scene from a novel. This was the real-life scheme of Cassie Chadwick, the Gilded Age's most daring con queen. In an era defined by staggering wealth and rigid social barriers, she weaponized the one thing the elite valued above all else: the appearance of status. Her story is a masterclass in deception, a thrilling exploration of how one person can exploit the very foundations of a system built on trust and exclusivity. We often hear tales of financial fraud, but Cassie's story transcends mere trickery. It's a piercing look into the glittering, often hypocritical, world of the Gilded Age, a time when immense fortunes were made overnight and social climbing was a national pastime. The banking elite, a club of powerful men who guarded their money and their reputations with equal ferocity, believed themselves to be impervious to such manipulation. They were the gatekeepers of capital, the architects of industry. Yet, Cassie Chadwick saw the cracks in their armor. She understood that their desire to be connected to a name like Carnegie, to have that level of influence within their grasp, could cloud even the sharpest judgment. Her con wasn't just about forging documents. It was about forging a fantasy so potent, so alluring, that it blinded the most skeptical minds to logic and due diligence. So how did she do it? What unique combination of charm, cunning, and cultural insight allowed a woman with a checkered past to pull off one of the most brazen financial deceptions in American history? The journey we're about to take will unravel the intricate web Cassie wove, from her early days as a small-time grifter to her breathtaking ascent into the highest echelons of society. We will explore the vulnerabilities of a male-dominated financial world that never saw her coming and discover how her eventual downfall sent shockwaves through the very institutions she duped. This is more than a true crime story. It's a tale of ambition, illusion, and the timeless question of whether we ever truly see what's in front of us, or merely what we desperately wish to see. Long before the name Cassie Chadwick ever graced a society column, she was Elizabeth Bigley, born into a life of poverty in 1857 in the small town of Eastwood, Ontario. Her childhood was a world away from the gilded ballrooms of New York, defined by a desperate lack of the very thing she would later learn to counterfeit so brilliantly: wealth and status. It was in this crucible of want that her unique talents first began to surface. She possessed an innate understanding that a compelling story, told with enough conviction, could bend reality to her will. Her first known foray into deception was a remarkably sophisticated one for a young woman. She created and attempted to cash a forged check. This wasn't a simple act of petty theft. It was a bold, imaginative leap, an attempt to write her own financial reality into existence. The scheme landed her in trouble, but it also provided a crucial lesson. She learned that the systems of finance, for all their apparent solidity, could be manipulated with the right piece of paper and enough nerve. Her personal life became another training ground for her evolving craft. She married a respectable physician, Dr. Wallace Springsteen, presenting herself as a woman of good standing. Yet, her deceptive nature couldn't be contained. Stories of fabricated illnesses and other manipulations began to surface, eroding the trust at the foundation of her marriage. The relationship ultimately collapsed under the weight of her falsehoods, but for Elizabeth, it was less a failure and more a field test. She saw firsthand how even an intelligent, professional man could be misled by a carefully constructed persona. This period honed her skills in emotional manipulation, teaching her how to leverage perceived vulnerability and charm to disarm suspicion. Each small-scale con, each fabricated story, was like a rehearsal for the grand performance of her life. She was learning her audience, refining her technique, and building the unshakable confidence that would later allow her to stare down powerful bankers without flinching. These early years were essential in building the foundation of the con artist she would become. The petty frauds taught her the mechanics of deception, the forged documents, the aliases, the quick thinking required when a story began to unravel. But the more profound lesson was psychological. She came to understand that people see what they want to see. A doctor wanted to believe his wife was fragile and in need of his care. A banker would later want to believe he had a privileged connection to unimaginable wealth. Elizabeth Bigley learned to identify that desire and then craft a mirror, reflecting back exactly what her target most longed for. She was transitioning from a simple grifter into a psychological puppeteer, and the stage was being set for her to leave her humble origins behind and step into a role of her own magnificent creation, one that would soon capture the attention of an entire nation. Her arrival in Cleveland marked a profound and deliberate reinvention. Elizabeth Bigley, the small-town forger, was completely erased, and in her place emerged Cassie Chadwick, a woman swathed in mystery and the finest silks money could buy. This new identity was her most ambitious creation yet. She cultivated an aura of sophisticated wealth that was both undeniable and deliberately vague. No one could quite pinpoint the source of her fortune, only that it seemed immense. She draped herself in extravagant jewelry, maintained a lavish household, and spoke in hushed tones of European connections and vast holdings, all while never providing a single verifiable detail. This ambiguity was not a flaw in her plan. It was the very engine of it. In the social circles of Cleveland's elite, where old money was often quiet and new money was loud and scrutinized, her subtle mystique made her all the more intriguing. She wasn't just pretending to be rich. She was performing a specific role, that of a woman so securely wealthy she had no need to prove it. It was a character designed to disarm the most pointed questions before they were even asked. This carefully constructed persona was the key that unlocked the door to high society, but it was her marriage to Dr. Leroy Chadwick that gave her the key to the house itself. Dr. Chadwick was a respected and well-established physician, a man whose name carried significant weight in the community. By becoming his wife, Cassie acquired something even more valuable than a luxurious wardrobe, an unimpeachable veneer of respectability. In the Gilded Age, a doctor's wife was expected to be a pillar of the community, a figure of moral and social standing. She leveraged this position with masterful precision, using the Chadwick name as a shield against suspicion. Now she wasn't just a mysterious woman with money. She was Mrs. Dr. Chadwick, a title that automatically granted her trust and access to the city's most powerful and affluent families. She hosted elegant parties, made generous but strategic donations to local charities, and became a fixture in a world that would have otherwise been completely closed to her. Every social interaction was a calculated move, another thread woven into the tapestry of her illusion, building a network of influential people who would later become unwitting references for her credibility. Laying the groundwork for her ultimate scheme required a psychological understanding of her peers. She knew that the wealthy are often the most susceptible to tales of even greater wealth. So she began to seed the rumor that would become the cornerstone of her con. In carefully curated conversations, often with a hint of feigned reluctance, she would let slip that she was the illegitimate daughter of the American steel titan, Andrew Carnegie. It was a breathtakingly audacious claim, but its power lay in its delicate plausibility. Carnegie was known to be a ruthless businessman, a man capable of great secrecy. The idea that he might have a secret child, one he supported lavishly but quietly, fit perfectly into the private dramas the elite loved to imagine. She never stated it outright in public. Instead, she let the rumor spread through whispers in parlors and at dinner tables, allowing others to connect the dots she had so artfully placed. They would see her unexplained wealth, her refined tastes, her air of hidden sorrow, and they would arrive at the conclusion themselves, believing it to be their own brilliant deduction. By the time she was ready to make her move on the banks, the story of her legendary paternity wasn't something she had to sell. It was something an entire city was already half convinced was true. With her reputation as a mysterious, wealthy heiress firmly established, and the tantalizing rumor of her connection to Carnegie circulating in polite society, Cassie Chadwick was ready to execute the central act of her grand deception. Her masterstroke was a piece of paper, a forged promissory note that would become the key to unlocking the vaults of America's most cautious financial institutions. The document itself was a work of art in the craft of fraud. It was not a simple handwritten IOU. It was a formal typewritten instrument, meticulously prepared to appear as a binding legal agreement from Andrew Carnegie. The note promised to pay his beloved daughter, Cassie L. Chadwick, the astronomical sum of $7 million, with interest accruing at a rate of 4% per annum. To the bankers she would later approach, this wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a direct, tangible link to the fortune of the world's richest man, and it looked completely legitimate. The language was formal, the figures were precise, and it bore what appeared to be the authentic signature of Andrew Carnegie himself, a flourish of ink that represented the entire foundation of her scheme. But a document locked away in a private safe holds no power. Cassie understood that for the note to have any persuasive force, its discovery needed to be a theatrical event, witnessed by people whose testimony would be beyond reproach. She orchestrated this moment with the skill of a stage director. The setting was her own home, and the audience was a group of respectable, influential women who were visiting her. At a carefully chosen moment, she brought out a trunk, explaining with a show of sentimental reluctance that it contained some of her most private and precious belongings. As she fumbled with the lock, she feigned surprise and confusion, announcing that a hidden, secret compartment had somehow sprung open. With wide, seemingly astonished eyes, she withdrew the folded promissory note. The performance was flawless. She appeared not as someone presenting evidence, but as someone who had just stumbled upon a profound and deeply personal secret in front of her closest friends. These society matrons, pillars of their community, became unwitting accomplices, their firsthand account of the note's dramatic discovery lending it an air of undeniable authenticity that no mere piece of paper could ever possess on its own. This single brilliant maneuver transformed her abstract rumor into concrete, collateral-backed reality. The promissory note was no longer just a story people whispered about. It was now a physical object that upstanding citizens had seen with their own eyes, emerging from a place of secrecy and sentiment. In the minds of the bankers she would soon target, this narrative short-circuited standard protocols. Why would such esteemed women lie? The very implausibility of the situation. A secret daughter, a hidden fortune, a dramatic discovery, somehow made it more believable because it felt like a scene from a grand novel. In truth, they reasoned, is often stranger than fiction. The note itself was the lure, but the story of its discovery was the hook. It created a foundation of credibility built not on financial audits, but on human emotion, social standing, and the irresistible allure of being let in on one of the world's most fabulous secrets. Armed with her forged promissory note and the eyewitness testimony of Cleveland's socialites, Cassie Chadwick now had to breathe life into her fictional identity. She didn't just claim to be Andrew Carnegie's daughter. She became the role with a method actor's intensity, crafting a persona so rich in detail and emotional complexity that it became nearly impossible to question. She spoke of the famous industrialist, not with the distant reverence of a public admirer, but with the intimate, pained familiarity of a wounded child. In hushed, confidential tones with bankers and new acquaintances, she would share the tragedy of her situation. She painted a picture of a doting yet fiercely private father who provided for her lavishly but could never publicly acknowledge her, lest he tarnish his public image and devastate his lawful family. This narrative of forbidden love and hidden sorrow made her story profoundly human and strangely noble, transforming her from a mere beneficiary of wealth into a sympathetic figure bearing a heavy, gilded cross. The specifics of her lies were masterfully tailored to exploit the social dynamics of the era. She claimed that her vast inheritance, often whispered to be in the tens of millions, was held in a secret trust managed by powerful and unnamed lawyers in New York. She explained her frequent mysterious trips to the city as necessary consultations about her financial affairs, lending a plausible cover for her absences and reinforcing the idea of a vast, complex fortune just beyond immediate reach. Crucially, she weaponized the very real culture of secrecy and gossip that thrived in Gilded Age high society. In a world where reputation was everything and public scandals could ruin a family, her plea for absolute discretion was not just believable, it was expected. By swearing bankers to secrecy, she wasn't just protecting her con, she was flattering them, making them feel like they were part of an exclusive inner circle privy to one of the world's most dazzling secrets. They weren't just loan officers. They were confidants and guardians of a dynastic mystery. Her performance extended to every facet of her life. When asked about her wealth, she would affect a sigh of resigned burden, speaking of the responsibility that came with her future fortune. She cultivated an air of someone who was above vulgar financial concerns, which made her occasional, pressing need for cash all the more convincing. A sudden, large loan wasn't for a frivolous purchase, she would imply, but a temporary bridge to access her trust funds, which were tied up in complex, long-term investments. This tapped directly into the prejudices of the time, where the very rich were known to have liquid assets factories, railroads, steel mills, while living off lines of credit. Her story perfectly mirrored the financial realities of the elite she was impersonating. The bankers who listened saw not a con artist, but a sophisticated woman of means navigating the same complex financial landscape as their other most valued clients. In their eagerness to secure the future business of the Carnegie heiress, they abandoned their professional skepticism, choosing to believe in a fairy tale because the potential reward, a connection to the Carnegie empire, was simply too intoxicating to risk losing. The time had come to put her meticulously constructed illusion to the ultimate test. Cassie Chadwick, now fully embodying the role of the wronged Carnegie heiress, set her sights on her first major financial target, the Bank of Oberlin in Ohio. This was not a random choice. Oberlin was a respectable, college-affiliated town, its bank presided over by men who were pillars of their community, but likely unaccustomed to dealing with fortunes of a truly national scale. It was the perfect environment for her blend of small-town respectability and metropolitan grandeur. Walking into the bank, she carried herself not with the aggressive posture of a businesswoman seeking a loan, but with the serene, unassuming confidence of someone to whom money was a birthright, a mere formality. Her approach was a masterclass in psychological reversal. She wasn't asking for a favor, she was offering an opportunity. She requested a meeting with the bank's president, and with an air of slight inconvenience, she presented her centerpiece, the forged promissory note from Andrew Carnegie. Her explanation was delivered not as a sales pitch, but as a confidential sharing of burdens. She framed her need for a loan as a temporary, almost trivial matter, a simple issue of liquidity, while her vast trust funds, managed by those elusive New York lawyers, were being reorganized. The sheer audacity of the document was its greatest strength. The amount, $7 million, was so astronomical that it seemed beyond the realm of forgery. Who would even dare, for the bank president, holding that piece of paper was like holding a key to a vault he had only ever dreamed of. He wasn't just looking at collateral, he was looking at a gateway into the inner circle of American industrial royalty. The psychological pressure on the bank president was immense and multifaceted. On one hand, there was the allure of future business, securing Cassie Chadwick, the secret daughter of Andrew Carnegie, as a client promised a relationship that could catapult his bank into a new league of prestige and profitability. The potential for managing even a fraction of her eventual inheritance was a siren song too powerful to ignore. On the other hand, there was the fear of offense. To subject this refined, sorrowful woman to the indignity of a rigorous background check, or to deny her simple request, would be a profound social misstep. It would signal a lack of trust and sophistication, potentially alienating not just her, but the entire web of Cleveland society that vouched for her. In the face of such a grand narrative, standard due diligence felt small, pedantic, and even disrespectful. Overwhelmed by this potent cocktail of greed and social anxiety, the bank president made a decision that would echo through financial history. He approved a substantial loan, handing over a significant sum of money. Reports suggest it was in the tens of thousands of dollars, a massive amount for the time, with little more than her signature and the forged note as security. He accepted her story and her document at face value, bypassing the fundamental checks that were the bedrock of his profession. He never contacted Andrew Carnegie's offices for verification, a step that would have instantly unraveled the entire scheme. In that moment, the solid, trustworthy foundation of the Bank of Oberlin was replaced by the shimmering, insubstantial mirage that Cassie Chadwick had so brilliantly conjured. This first success was more than just a financial windfall. It was a devastating proof of concept. It demonstrated that the appearance of extreme wealth could be more powerful than wealth itself, and it gave Cassie the confidence and the capital to take her audacious performance to an even larger stage. Flush with cash from the Oberlin Bank and radiating the confidence of someone whose credit had just been validated, Cassie Chadwick took her scheme on the road. Her success in a smaller Ohio market was merely a dress rehearsal for the main performance, and her next targets were the very heart of American finance, the prestigious banks of New York City and Boston. She understood that to truly live the part of a Carnegie heiress, she needed to operate on a national stage, and that required a more sophisticated financial choreography than simply presenting a single forged note. Her genius now shifted from creating a static illusion to engineering a dynamic, self-perpetuating cycle of debt that would keep her afloat for years. She developed a financial shell game of breathtaking simplicity and effectiveness, using the credibility gained from one institution to unlock the vaults of the next. Her method relied on a fundamental principle of banking psychology. The perception of reliability is often more valuable than the reality of assets. She would secure a large loan from one bank, say for $50,000. Rather than spending it all immediately, she would use a portion of those funds to make a small but crucially prompt interest payment on a previous loan from a different bank. To that second bank, this wasn't just a payment, it was a signal. It was proof that their esteemed client, the secret Carnegie daughter, was as good as her word. She was liquid, responsible, and managing her complex affairs with impeccable timing. This performance of fiscal responsibility was a powerful narcotic, dulling the instincts of even the most seasoned bankers. They saw a client who respected her obligations, which in their minds was the behavior of a truly wealthy person, not a desperate fraudster. This created a powerful domino effect. Each successful transaction and each on-time payment added another layer of gold leaf to her reputation. A banker in Boston wouldn't just see a mysterious woman with a fantastic story. He would hear, through the discreet whispers of the financial world, that Mrs. Chadwick had an outstanding loan with a respected New York institution and was meeting her obligations flawlessly. This implicit endorsement from a peer was often all the due diligence they felt was needed. Why dig deeper when a fellow financier had already vouched for her with his own institution's capital? She was building a web of interlocking debts where each new loan helped service an old one, creating a facade of a vast, humming financial engine. The banks, in their eagerness to have a piece of the future Carnegie fortune, became unwitting cogs in that very machine, providing the fuel that kept the illusion spinning faster and faster. Her trips to New York were particularly masterful. She would arrive in the city with the aura of a visiting head of state, checking into the most expensive hotels and holding court in opulent suites. She didn't go to the banks, she summoned their officers to her. This subtle power dynamic was deliberate. By making them come to her, she established herself as the one in a position of privilege, reversing the traditional lender-borrower relationship. In these lavish settings, surrounded by evidence of her extravagant spending, she would speak vaguely of adjustments to her trust or temporary cash flow complexities with her European holdings. She presented her need for a loan not as a necessity, but as a minor inconvenience, a bureaucratic hiccup in her otherwise flawless financial empire. The bankers, sitting in a hotel room that cost more than their monthly salary, found it all too easy to believe. The sheer scale of her performance made the loans she requested seem trivial by comparison. At its peak, this self-sustaining cycle of credit allowed Cassie to amass a staggering amount of debt, with estimates ranging from $100,000 to over $200,000, a sum equivalent to many millions today. She wasn't just stealing money. She was building a phantom credit profile so robust that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more money she borrowed and reliably serviced, the more money institutions were willing to lend. They were not just lending against a forged document anymore. They were lending against her established track record of being a superb debtor. In their ledgers, she was as solid as a government bond. This was the pinnacle of her deception, the moment her fiction achieved a terrifying form of financial reality. The banking elite, the guardians of American capital, had been completely seduced by a narrative they helped write themselves, pouring real wealth into a bottomless pit built on nothing but audacity, a clever forgery, and the universal, blinding desire to get close to a legend. In the end, Cassie Chadwick's most potent weapon wasn't the forged document itself, but her profound understanding of the human vulnerabilities that governed the men who held the keys to the nation's wealth. She recognized that these bankers, for all their financial acumen, were driven by forces far more powerful than balance sheets, a deep-seated hunger for prestige, a fiercely competitive spirit, and an unadulterated greed that could be skillfully manipulated. She didn't just present a financial proposal. She offered them an irresistible psychological package, one that promised to elevate them from mere financiers to architects of industrial destiny. Her genius lay in transforming a simple loan transaction into a test of their ambition and a measure of their worth. Consider the competitive landscape of Gilded Age banking. In cities like New York and Boston, financial institutions were locked in a constant, quiet war for supremacy, all vying for the most prestigious clients and the most lucrative deals. Cassie masterfully tapped into this rivalry. When she hinted that another competing bank was also eager to handle her affairs, it wasn't a subtle threat. It was a spark to the tinder of their professional pride. The thought of a rival securing the future business of Andrew Carnegie's secret heir was an unbearable prospect. It wasn't merely about the profit from a single loan. It was about the catastrophic loss of face and the potential to be permanently locked out of the upper echelons of finance. She made them feel that saying no wasn't just a conservative business decision, but a career-ending failure of vision. In their minds, they weren't just approving a loan. They were making a strategic investment to block a competitor and secure a dynasty. Beyond this calculated competition, she expertly flattered their egos, making them feel less like bankers and more like privileged confidants. By swearing them to absolute secrecy regarding her true parentage, she bestowed upon them a gift far more valuable than a simple business relationship: the intoxicating feeling of being an insider. They were no longer just loan officers. They were guardians of one of America's greatest secrets, trusted allies to a woman at the center of a hidden dynastic drama. This sense of exclusive access was a powerful narcotic. It blinded them to the elementary checks they would perform on any other applicant. To question her story would be to shatter the very illusion that made them feel so important and chosen. They were so enamored with their role as protectors of the secret that they became its most ardent defenders, willfully ignoring any inconsistencies in her narrative. And then there was the sheer, unadulterated greed, the vision of endless future business that she dangled before them like a golden apple. She spoke not in terms of thousands, but in terms of millions. The millions she would one day inherit and would need to invest, manage, and grow. A single loan of $50,000 was presented as a trivial down payment, a mere gesture of goodwill that would unlock a relationship worth 100 times that amount. Bankers, trained to think in terms of long-term yields and compound interest, began to see her not as a borrower, but as a walking, talking asset. They were making a small, calculated bet for an unimaginably large payoff. The potential for managing even a fraction of the Carnegie fortune was a siren song that drowned out the quiet voice of reason. In their pursuit of this phantom fortune, they abandoned the very principles of risk assessment they had built their careers upon, choosing instead to chase a fantasy she had so brilliantly sold them. They were not merely deceived. They were complicit in their own deception, so captivated by the glittering future she promised that they willingly ignored the shaky foundation of the present. The fortune Cassie Chadwick siphoned from the vaults of America's most cautious banks did not sit idly in an account. It was immediately put to work as the primary prop in her ongoing theatrical production. The money was not for saving, it was for spending, and spending in the most spectacularly visible way possible. Every dollar was an investment in her credibility, a tangible piece of evidence meant to silence any lingering whisper of doubt. Her grand stage was a magnificent mansion on Cleveland's famed Euclid Avenue, a street known as Millionaires' Row, where the titans of industry built their palaces. Cassie's home was no different. She acquired a sprawling, opulently furnished residence, filling its rooms with the finest European furniture, imported carpets, and priceless works of art. It was a physical declaration of her status, a monument to wealth so imposing that it seemed to make financial verification unnecessary. Who would dare question the legitimacy of a woman who lived in a palace fit for a Carnegie? Her personal presentation was a daily exercise in strategic extravagance. She became a walking advertisement for her own fictional fortune, draped in the most expensive furs and adorned with dazzling diamonds and pearls. She didn't just wear jewelry, she was armored in it. Her gowns were commissioned from the best dressmakers, creations of silk and velvet that whispered of unlimited resources. This was a crucial part of her psychological warfare. When a banker came to call, he wasn't just meeting a client. He was entering a world of almost unimaginable luxury. He would see the servants, smell the perfume of exotic flowers, and observe Cassie herself, utterly at ease in this environment, as if born to it. The sheer sensory overload of her wealth made the idea that she could be a fraud feel absurd. Her appearance was a constant, silent argument in her favor, one that was far more persuasive than any forged document could ever be alone. But Cassie understood that true social power in the Gilded Age wasn't just about private wealth. It was about public performance. She became a legendary hostess, throwing parties and musicales that were the talk of Cleveland society. These were not simple gatherings. They were meticulously orchestrated events designed to showcase her generosity and cement her status. The finest champagne flowed, orchestras played, and the city's elite mingled in her glittering parlors. By welcoming the most respected families into her home, she created a powerful feedback loop. Their presence at her events served as a public endorsement of her character. If the Silsbys or the Wades saw fit to dine at her table, then surely she was everything she claimed to be. Each party was a living tableau of her success, a scene where everyone present became an extra in the grand drama of her life, reinforcing the illusion for each other and for any watching creditors. Perhaps her most cunning use of the stolen funds was her very public and very calculated philanthropy. Cassie made generous, highly visible donations to local churches and charities. She would arrive at fundraisers and, with a dramatic flourish, write a check for a sum that made everyone gasp. This served a dual, devastatingly effective purpose. First, it painted her as a benevolent and civic-minded woman, the very model of a Gilded Age lady who used her wealth for the public good. This charitable persona built a reservoir of goodwill that made it even harder for anyone to believe ill of her. Second, and more insidiously, it created a powerful social shield. How could the president of the bank that just loaned her $50,000 possibly question her financial stability when he saw her name lauded in the newspaper for donating $5,000 to the new hospital wing? Her extravagant giving made her seem not just rich, but morally unimpeachable, placing her beyond the realm of financial suspicion. She was spending their money to buy their unwavering trust, a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of deception. And so we arrive at one of the most enduring mysteries at the heart of this entire saga: the role of Dr. Leroy Chadwick. Was this respected, established physician a cunning accomplice who guided his wife's schemes from the shadows? Was he a hopelessly duped victim, completely taken in by the very same performance that fooled the bankers? Or was his position somewhere in the murky middle, a man practicing a form of willful ignorance, choosing not to look too closely at the source of the luxury that now filled his home? The evidence points not to a simple answer, but to a profound and telling human complexity. When Cassie married the doctor, she gained a priceless asset: his unimpeachable reputation. He was her anchor to reality, the solid ground upon which her fantastical fiction was built. In the beginning, it is entirely plausible that he was just another one of her marks, charmed and captivated by this mysterious, wealthy widow. A man of science and fact, he may have found her tales of European travels and unknown resources easy to accept, especially as they were backed by the tangible evidence of her spending. His own social standing provided the cover she desperately needed, and for a time, it must have seemed like a perfect, if unconventional, partnership. Yet as the years passed and the scale of her operations grew, the whispers in Cleveland's social circles must have reached his ears. The sheer volume of money flowing through their Euclid Avenue mansion would have been impossible to ignore. Servants were paid, merchants supplied the finest goods, and extravagant parties were funded, all seemingly from an endless, unseen well. A man of Dr. Chadwick's intelligence and professional standing could not have been entirely blind to the financial mechanics, or lack thereof, in his own household. This is where the concept of willful ignorance becomes so compelling. To confront Cassie would be to risk everything: the luxurious lifestyle, the social prominence, the reflected glow of being married to a figure of such intrigue and apparent wealth. Turning a blind eye allowed him to enjoy the benefits without confronting the terrifying source. He may have constructed his own rationalizations, convincing himself that her New York lawyers were handling everything, or that her financial dealings were simply beyond his understanding as a medical man. The pressure to maintain appearances in Gilded Age society was immense, and Dr. Chadwick was not immune to its powerful pull. The strain of this double life, however, inevitably began to fracture their marriage. While Cassie was jet-setting to New York on her financial consultations, Dr. Chadwick remained in Cleveland, tending to his practice, and we can assume, fielding increasingly awkward questions. His professional reputation, once his greatest asset, was becoming intertwined with her precarious house of cards. Other doctors and their wives, the very pillars of the community he relied upon, were starting to talk. The constant anxiety of exposure, of a scandal that could destroy the respectable life he had built, must have been a heavy burden. They lived under the same roof, but inhabited entirely different worlds. His one of diagnoses and prescriptions, hers one of forged documents and carefully managed illusions. The intimacy of a true marriage likely evaporated, replaced by a tense, business-like arrangement, shrouded in unspoken truths and deliberate silence. The cracks became a chasm when the first tremors of the impending collapse began. As investigators started to quietly ask questions and the financial press picked up the scent of the story, Dr. Chadwick was forced to move from a passive state of ignorance to an active state of self-preservation. His actions here speak volumes. He did not stand defiantly by his wife's side, proclaiming her innocence. Instead, he took the drastic and legally clear step of severing all financial ties with her. In a move that was both coldly practical and deeply symbolic, he transferred the deed to their lavish mansion solely into her name. This was not the act of a loyal husband. It was the act of a man building a firewall between himself and the coming inferno. He was publicly distancing himself, attempting to salvage what remained of his professional standing and personal finances from the wreckage he surely saw approaching. His eventual decision to provide testimony against her to the authorities sealed his position not as a partner in crime, but as a witness for the prosecution. In the end, Dr. Leroy Chadwick appears most convincingly as a tragic figure, a man who initially enjoyed the fruits of a deception he may not have fully comprehended, but who ultimately became its victim, watching in horror as the glittering world his wife built collapsed and threatened to take his own honorable life's work down with it. For all her meticulous planning and psychological manipulation, Cassie Chadwick's empire of illusion rested on a single, fragile thread: the assumption that no one would ever dare to directly contact the man at the center of her myth. That thread began to fray not in a dramatic courtroom scene, but in the quiet, methodical mind of Herbert L. Newton, the president of the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin. Newton was the very first banker to have loaned Cassie money, and initially, he had been as captivated as the others. But as time passed, a low, persistent hum of unease began to trouble him. It wasn't one glaring error that raised his suspicion, but a series of subtle incongruities that, when viewed together, formed a troubling pattern. The sheer size of the promissory note, while impressive, started to feel less like a mark of supreme wealth and more like a fantastical prop. He began to wonder why a woman with access to such a vast, liquid fortune from Andrew Carnegie would repeatedly need relatively small loans from a provincial Ohio bank. The story, so compelling at first, was beginning to smell more of theater than of finance. Newton's professional duty finally overrode his fear of causing social offense. He decided to undertake a discreet but definitive verification. In a move that should have been standard practice from the very beginning, he wrote a carefully worded letter directly to Andrew Carnegie's offices in New York. He did not outright accuse Cassie of fraud. Instead, he framed it as a matter of banking protocol, inquiring politely about the validity of the promissory note made out to a Mrs. Cassie L. Chadwick. The reply he received was swift, brutal, and utterly unequivocal. From the desk of the steel magnate himself came a terse, furious denial. Andrew Carnegie had never heard of any Cassie Chadwick. He certainly had no illegitimate daughter, and the so-called promissory note was a blatant and outrageous forgery. The foundation of Cassie's entire world, the document she had presented with such theatrical flair, was instantly exposed as worthless paper. This bombshell from New York sent Newton into a controlled panic. He immediately contacted other financial institutions in the region with whom he knew Cassie had done business, sharing the devastating news. The reaction among the banking community was a mixture of sheer terror and profound humiliation. The discreet whispers that had once cemented her credibility now became a frantic telegraph of exposure. Fear is a powerful contagion, and the fear of catastrophic financial loss and professional ruin spread through these banks like wildfire. One institution, hoping to quietly recoup its funds before a public scandal could erupt, made a fateful decision. They dispatched a lawyer to Cassie's Euclid Avenue mansion to confront her directly and demand immediate, full repayment of her outstanding loans. This was the moment the private investigation threatened to become a very public collapse. Cassie, however, was a master improviser. When the lawyer arrived, she did not panic or confess. Instead, she met him with a performance of wounded outrage and glacial calm. she expressed shock that her word and her collateral were being questioned. She treated the lawyer's presence not as a legitimate collection effort, but as a profound personal insult. With an air of exasperated nobility, she declared that she would settle this petty matter immediately. She would, she said, travel to New York at once to retrieve the necessary funds from her trust. It was a brilliant stalling tactic, perfectly in character. She was once again leveraging the myth of her New York connections to buy herself precious time. The lawyer, likely disarmed by her confidence and the sheer opulence surrounding her, had little choice but to acquiesce. He left the mansion without the money, but the noose was tightening. The quiet inquiries had turned into direct demands, and the web of lies was now vibrating with the footsteps of her pursuers. The meticulously constructed house of cards, having withstood years of subtle scrutiny and quiet doubts, finally met its match in the rigorous, unyielding protocols of a Boston financial institution. While the initial alarm from Oberlin had been contained through Cassie's masterful performance, the sheer scale of her operations in a major financial hub like Boston made a broader collapse almost inevitable. It was here, at the Old Colony Bank, or a similarly prestigious establishment, that a routine internal audit or a newly initiated credit review began to trace the threads of her financial footprint. A junior clerk or a cautious manager, following standard procedure, started compiling a list of her outstanding liabilities. What began as a simple administrative task quickly spiraled into a shocking revelation. The numbers on the page told a story far different from the one Cassie Chadwick presented in her silk gowns. They revealed not a woman of limitless means, but one entangled in a complex, interconnected web of debt that stretched from Ohio to New York. The auditor's report would have laid out the facts with cold, numerical precision. Mrs. Cassie L. Chadwick held substantial, unsecured loans at multiple institutions, and these obligations were not isolated. They formed a precarious, circular structure. A loan from Bank A appeared to be serviced by funds drawn from a newer loan at Bank B. There were no visible assets to counterbalance these massive liabilities, no property held in her name beyond the mansion, which was likely mortgaged to its limit, no stock certificates, no evidence of the legendary trust fund. The promissory note from Andrew Carnegie, the centerpiece of her entire scheme, was the only collateral listed across multiple banks, a single piece of paper supposedly backing hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit. To a trained financial eye, this was not the profile of an heiress. It was the classic signature of a Ponzi scheme, a financial vortex sustained only by constant infusions of new capital. This discovery sent a tremor of pure panic through the Boston Bank's boardroom. The immediate fear was not just the loss of their own loaned funds, but the terrifying realization that they were just one of many creditors all chasing the same phantom fortune. In the world of high finance, the first creditor to act decisively often has the best chance of recovering something, while those who hesitate are left with nothing but worthless claims. The bank's leadership, facing catastrophic losses and professional humiliation, had no choice but to sound the alarm. They did not do so quietly. They immediately dispatched telegrams and made urgent telephone calls to every other financial institution they knew to be involved, from the smaller Ohio banks to the powerful New York houses. The message was stark and unambiguous. Cassie Chadwick was a fraud. Her collateral was fictitious, and a coordinated legal assault was necessary to salvage whatever assets remained. The chain reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The discreet network of trust that Cassie had so carefully cultivated now became a conduit for her ruin. Bank presidents who had once competed for her favor now found themselves in a frantic, unseemly race to the courthouse. Lawsuits were filed in rapid succession, each institution scrambling to be the first to secure a judgment against her, to put a lien on her property, or to freeze any accounts they could find. The very greed that had blinded them now fueled their desperation. The whispers that had once cemented her legend now broadcast her exposure across the entire eastern seaboard. Reporters, always hungry for a story involving high society and scandal, caught the scent. The private financial crisis erupted into a very public spectacle, with headlines screaming about the downfall of the Carnegie heiress. The opulent world she had built on Euclid Avenue was suddenly besieged not by admirers, but by lawyers, process servers, and journalists, all demanding answers to questions she could no longer deflect with a sigh and a story. The performance was over, and the harsh lights of reality had been switched on. The final act of Cassie Chadwick's grand performance began not with a whisper, but with a media detonation. Her arrest, when it finally came, was orchestrated for maximum spectacle. Federal authorities, armed with warrants and a mountain of evidence from the panicked bankers, tracked her to a hotel in New York City. The scene was a stark contrast to her usual elegant surroundings. Instead of being surrounded by adoring society figures, she was confronted by stern-faced officers who placed her under arrest on charges of conspiracy and obtaining money under false pretenses. The woman who had commanded the attention of millionaires was now just another prisoner, her famed silks and diamonds replaced by the plain garb of a detainee. Yet, even in captivity, she understood her audience. As she was escorted from the hotel, she carried herself with a defiant dignity, offering no confession, no tears, but a cool, almost regal composure that only fueled the growing legend. The press, which had been circling the story for weeks, descended with a fury usually reserved for political scandals or declarations of war. Newspapers from coast to coast splashed her story across their front pages, competing with ever more sensational headlines. They christened her with monikers that captured the public's imagination: the Queen of Ohio, a title that acknowledged the scale of her domain, and more pointedly, America's greatest female swindler. This was more than just reporting a crime. It was the creation of a celebrity villainess for the Gilded Age. Reporters scrambled to unearth every detail of her past, from her humble origins in Canada to her various marriages and small-time frauds, piecing together the biography of a woman who had seemingly written her own destiny with a forged pen. What made the scandal so irresistibly captivating for the American public was its perfect fusion of two worlds that were usually kept separate: the opaque, intimidating realm of high finance and the glittering, gossip-fueled theater of high society. For the average person struggling to make ends meet, the story was a delicious fantasy of comeuppance. The mighty bankers, those aloof guardians of capital who so often seemed untouchable, had been made to look like fools by a woman. Cassie became an unlikely and deeply flawed folk hero, a symbol of the little person striking back at an unjust system, even if her methods were entirely criminal. At the same time, the scandal offered a tantalizing glimpse behind the velvet curtain of the elite. The public devoured stories of her lavish parties, her extravagant gowns, and her Euclid Avenue mansion, living vicariously through her audacious infiltration of a world they could only read about in novels. It was a real-life melodrama, complete with a tragic heroine, duped villains, and a fortune that never was. The trial itself became a national circus, a media event that transfixed the country. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, reporters, and the simply curious, all eager to see the woman who had hoodwinked the establishment. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision, presenting a parade of humiliated bankers who detailed how they had been so utterly deceived. The physical evidence was undeniable. The forged promissory note was entered into the record, a simple piece of paper that had unraveled an entire web of trust. Cassie's defense was, by all accounts, as theatrical as her life. She maintained her story of being Carnegie's secret daughter to the very end, a performance of such steadfast conviction that it left some observers wondering if she had even begun to believe the lie herself. Yet the facts were overwhelming. The jury returned a swift verdict of guilty, and the judge, reflecting the outrage of the financial world and the public spectacle she had created, sentenced her to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The Queen of Ohio's reign was officially and decisively over. The trial of Cassie Chadwick was, from its very first day, less a legal proceeding and more a grand public reckoning, a spectacular finale to the drama she had so meticulously staged. The courtroom itself became a theater, with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and a parade of witnesses all playing their parts in the final unraveling of her magnificent lie. The prosecution's strategy was brutally straightforward: to overwhelm the jury with a mountain of cold, hard facts and the humiliated testimony of the men who had been so thoroughly duped. They laid out their case with the precision of accountants, which in many ways they were. The star piece of evidence was, of course, the forged promissory note itself. As it was entered into the official record, the $7 million figure seemed to suck the air out of the room. Prosecutors then presented a procession of bank presidents and loan officers from Oberlin, Cleveland, New York, and Boston. Each man took the stand, a picture of shattered pride and financial terror, to recount in painstaking detail how they had been seduced by Cassie's story and had handed over enormous sums with little more than her word and that single piece of paper as security. Their collective testimony painted a devastating portrait of an entire financial system blinded by its own greed and ambition, in stark contrast to the dry financial recitations of the prosecution. Cassie Chadwick's defense relied almost entirely on the power of the persona she had cultivated for years. Her strategy was not to dispute the facts of the loans, but to dispute the characterization of them as fraudulent. Her lawyers argued that she was a woman of immense, if complex, wealth, and that these were simply routine credit transactions between a sophisticated client and her bankers. They attempted to frame the entire case as a misunderstanding, a failure of the banks to properly comprehend the intricate nature of her private trust. To support this, they put forward character witnesses from Cleveland society women who had attended her parties and could attest to her generosity and refined character. They tried to create a smokescreen of respectability, suggesting that a woman of such evident social standing could not possibly be a common criminal. It was a bold, almost desperate gambit, betting everything on the lingering power of her illusion to confuse the clear-cut evidence of her deception. The entire trial, however, hinged on the moment Cassie herself took the stand. The courtroom was packed to the rafters, every spectator leaning forward in anticipation. Would the queen finally break? Would she show remorse or admit her guilt? What they witnessed was a performance of such unwavering, icy defiance that it left many observers stunned. Cassie did not play the weeping victim, nor did she express a shred of regret. Instead, she was cool, collected, and utterly imperious. She met the prosecutor's questions with a gaze of pure contempt, often answering with long, convoluted explanations about her financial affairs that were deliberately designed to obfuscate and confuse. She spoke of her father, Andrew Carnegie, with a rehearsed sadness, and of the bankers as petty men who were now trying to destroy her out of spite for being excluded from her inner circle. When confronted directly with the forged note, she did not flinch. She maintained that it was genuine, a private agreement between a father and his daughter, and she implied that Carnegie's public denials were merely a continuation of his lifelong effort to keep their relationship a secret. It was a breathtaking display of nerve, a performance so committed that it seemed, for a few fleeting moments, to cast a shadow of doubt on the entire proceeding. This confrontational stance, however, ultimately proved to be her undoing. The prosecution seized on her testimony, using it to highlight the sheer absurdity of her claims. They forced her to account for the specific details of her fictional trust fund, her mysterious New York lawyers, and her complete lack of any verifiable assets. Under this relentless, factual pressure, her regal composure began to show hairline fractures. Her answers became more evasive, her stories less consistent. The confident heiress gradually gave way to a woman caught in a web of her own making, yet still refusing to admit the threads were fake. The jury, composed of ordinary men who understood the simple value of $1, saw through the performance. They recognized the difference between complex wealth and no wealth at all. After a surprisingly short deliberation, they returned with a verdict of guilty on all major counts. The judge, reflecting the severity of the crime and the scale of the financial damage, sentenced Cassie Chadwick to 10 years in the federal penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. The gavel fell not just on a trial, but on an era of illusion, silencing the most captivating voice of deception the Gilded Age had ever known. Her legal team faced a monumental challenge, tasked with defending the indefensible against a mountain of documentary evidence and the furious testimony of the financial elite. Their strategy was a fascinating, multi-pronged approach that often seemed to contradict itself, reflecting the complex nature of their client and the public mood. The primary and most audacious line of defense was to double down on the very fiction that had landed her in court. Cassie's lawyers did not portray her as a mentally unstable victim of circumstance. Instead, they presented her as exactly who she claimed to be, a wronged and secretive heiress. They argued that the promissory note was genuine, a private family compact, and that Andrew Carnegie's very public denials were a cruel but predictable part of the lifelong charade to protect his public reputation. This argument required the jury to believe that the entire American financial and industrial establishment was engaged in a massive conspiracy to silence one woman, a narrative that was as bold as Cassie's original con. Alongside this, they worked tirelessly to undermine the credibility of the bankers who testified against her. The defense painted these powerful men not as victims of a crime, but as willing participants driven by their own insatiable greed. They cross-examined each humiliated president and loan officer with a singular focus, to expose that they had violated their own banking principles. Why had they not verified the note with Carnegie's office? Why had they lent such enormous sums with so little collateral beyond a story? The lawyers framed these not as failures of due diligence, but as acts of pure avarice. The bankers, they suggested, were so desperate to get a piece of the Carnegie fortune that they willfully ignored the rules. And now, caught with empty coffers, they were scapegoating Cassie to save their own careers and institutions. This narrative sought to shift the jury's sympathy away from the powerful banks and toward the woman they had so eagerly funded. And to a surprising degree, this strategy found a receptive audience beyond the courtroom walls. Among the general public, a significant wave of sympathy began to swell for Cassie Chadwick. For every person who saw her as a common criminal, there seemed to be another who viewed her as a folk hero. In an era of vast income inequality and public distrust of the robber barons, her story resonated as a tale of a clever underdog beating the powerful at their own game. She was a woman who had used her wits and charm to extract millions from a system dominated by arrogant, greedy men who considered themselves infallible. Newspapers and cartoons of the time often depicted her not with malice, but with a wink and a nod, as if to say, "You have to admire her nerve." She became a symbol of resistance, a personification of the idea that the entire Gilded Age was, in its own way, one giant con, and she was merely playing the game better than most. This public sympathy was deeply intertwined with contemporary attitudes toward gender. Cassie Chadwick utterly defied the Victorian ideal of the passive, delicate woman. Here was a figure of immense ambition, intelligence, and agency, who had navigated the exclusively male world of high finance and, for a glorious few years, won. For some women, particularly those chafing against the strict social confines of the era, her audacity was secretly thrilling. She had taken the tools available to her, charm, performance, and a sharp understanding of human psychology, and had wielded them with more power and effect than any businessman with a ledger. Her story exposed the hypocrisies of the system. The same men who would never have taken a business meeting with a woman were all too happy to lend one money when she appealed to their vanity and their greed. The public spectacle of her trial became a referendum not just on one woman's crime, but on the corruptibility of the entire male-dominated power structure she had so brilliantly exploited. In the hushed, tense atmosphere of the courtroom, the jury's return signaled the final curtain on Cassie Chadwick's elaborate performance. After a relatively short deliberation, the foreman delivered the verdict: guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy and obtaining money under false pretenses. The words echoed with a stark finality, legally dismantling the persona she had so carefully crafted over nearly a decade. The woman who had dined with society's elite and commanded the respect of powerful bankers, was now officially a convicted felon. The gasps in the room were not just for the verdict itself, but for the sheer scale of the deception it confirmed. The fictional fortune, the forged documents, and the web of lies were all laid bare and given a legal name. All that remained was for the judge to impose a sentence, and his remarks from the bench were a scathing indictment not only of Cassie's crimes, but of the profound damage she had inflicted on the very foundation of financial trust. He spoke of a scheme of colossal proportions, a deliberate and systematic assault on the banking system that had eroded public confidence and ruined the careers of several men who had placed their faith in her. The judge highlighted her complete lack of remorse, noting her defiant testimony and her continued insistence on a story that the evidence had thoroughly disproven. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, he asserted. It was a sustained, calculated campaign of fraud that demanded a punishment severe enough to serve as a stark warning to others. The sentence he handed down was indeed severe for its time: 10 years of imprisonment at the federal penitentiary in Albany, New York. This was not a minor term. It was a substantial portion of a person's life, intended to reflect the gravity of her offenses. The choice of a federal prison rather than a local jail underscored that her crimes were considered offenses against the nation's financial integrity itself. The gavel's fall marked an absolute and unchangeable conclusion. The legal machinery of the United States government had processed her case, weighed the evidence, and rendered its ultimate judgment. There would be no glorious escape, no last-minute revelation that proved her story true. The law had spoken, and the Queen of Ohio's reign was decisively, irrevocably over. The transition from the gilded ballrooms of Cleveland to the cold, unforgiving reality of a federal prison cell was a shock of almost unimaginable proportions for Cassie Chadwick. The Albany Penitentiary was a world defined by iron bars, regimented routines, and a stark absence of the luxury that had been the very fabric of her existence. Stripped of her silks and diamonds and issued a standard, coarse prison uniform, the woman who had once commanded the attention of millionaires was now just inmate number 6075. The performance was over and the audience was gone, replaced by guards who viewed her with institutional indifference and fellow inmates who saw her not as a celebrity, but as just another convict. The psychological whiplash of this new reality must have been devastating. For years, her entire sense of self had been built upon the reflection she saw in the admiring, envious, or greedy eyes of others. In prison, that mirror shattered, leaving her alone with the hollowed-out truth of her situation. Initially, Cassie attempted to maintain a shred of her former regal bearing, a final, feeble echo of the persona she had so brilliantly crafted. She reportedly carried herself with a certain haughtiness, attempting to project an air of misunderstood nobility even within the prison walls. This facade, however, was met with a mixture of curiosity and hostility from other prisoners. To many of them, she was a fascinating anomaly, a high society swindler whose crimes were of a scale and audacity they could scarcely comprehend. Some may have harbored a secret admiration for her nerve, while others likely resented the privilege and attention her notoriety brought her. The prison guards, for their part, treated her with a detached professionalism that refused to acknowledge the grand legend she had built. They saw not the Queen of Ohio, but a middle-aged woman who had committed serious financial crimes and was now serving her sentence. This institutional anonymity was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all, a daily denial of the very identity she had fought so hard to create. As the months of her sentence stretched into years, the relentless grind of prison life began to take a profound toll on both her body and her mind. The woman who had thrived on excitement, social intrigue, and the adrenaline of deception was now trapped in a monotonous, soul-crushing routine. Reports from the time suggest her physical health deteriorated rapidly. She was said to have lost a significant amount of weight, and her once vibrant energy faded into a listless exhaustion. The robust constitution that had allowed her to travel, host, and scheme with such vigor was broken by the poor nutrition, lack of proper medical care, and the sheer psychological weight of her confinement. More devastating than the physical decline, however, was the collapse of her mental state. The brilliant, agile mind that had constructed one of America's greatest cons began to falter under the weight of her grim reality. She was described as becoming increasingly depressed, withdrawn, and prone to bouts of melancholy. The fire of defiance that had burned so brightly during her trial was slowly extinguished, replaced by a deep and pervasive despair. Even from within her cell, the fighter in her had not been completely extinguished. Cassie and her legal team made several attempts to challenge her conviction and secure an early release. They filed appeals, arguing various technicalities and questioning the fairness of her trial. One of their primary arguments centered on the intense media scrutiny that had surrounded her case, claiming it had created a prejudicial atmosphere that made an impartial trial impossible. This was not an entirely baseless claim. The newspapers had indeed sensationalized every detail of her story. However, the courts consistently rejected these appeals, finding that the evidence against her was overwhelming and that the legal process had been properly followed. She also made petitions for a presidential pardon, a long-shot hope that was almost certainly doomed from the start. Given the scale of the financial ruin she had caused and the public humiliation she had inflicted upon the banking industry, there was little political will to show her any clemency. Each denied appeal and rejected petition was another nail in the coffin of her hopes, reinforcing the finality of her 10-year sentence and deepening her sense of hopelessness. The stark contrast between her life before and during incarceration could not have been more absolute. In her mansion on Euclid Avenue, she had been the center of a glittering universe, surrounded by beautiful objects and people who hung on her every word. In prison, she was surrounded by concrete and iron, her world reduced to the few feet of her cell and the regulated hours of the prison yard. The woman who had defined herself through audacious creation was now powerless, her life dictated by the ringing of bells and the commands of others. This loss of agency was a special kind of torment for someone of her cunning and ambition. The very talents that had brought her fame and fortune, her charm, her intelligence, her ability to manipulate narratives, were utterly useless in this environment. She was left with nothing but time to reflect on the spectacular rise and catastrophic fall of the magnificent illusion that was Cassie Chadwick, a reflection that likely offered little comfort in the cold silence of her cell. Quantifying the full financial devastation left in Cassie Chadwick's wake is a staggering exercise, one that reveals just how deeply her deception cut into the American financial system. While precise records from the era can be fragmentary, the most reliable estimates place the total sum she successfully swindled from various banks at well over $200,000. To truly grasp the magnitude of that figure, we must translate it into today's terms. Adjusted for inflation, that $200,000 from the early 1900s equates to a breathtaking sum ranging between $6 and $7 million in modern currency. This wasn't just a significant fraud. It was a heist on a scale that threatened the stability of entire institutions, a multi-million-dollar phantom fortune conjured from nothing but paper and audacity. The list of institutions that fell victim to her scheme reads like a who's who of regional financial powerhouses, each one suffering a profound blow to its reserves and its reputation. The Bank of Oberlin in Ohio, where her scheme first found success, faced catastrophic losses that crippled its operations. In Cleveland, the institution that bore the name of her own husband, Dr. Chadwick's bank, was hit particularly hard, a cruel irony that tied the doctor's professional standing directly to his wife's crimes. But her ambition didn't stop in Ohio. She targeted and secured massive loans from prestigious banks in New York City, including the Hanover National Bank, and from powerful lenders in Boston, such as the Old Colony Bank. These were not small provincial operations. They were pillars of American finance, and the fact that she was able to penetrate their defenses so completely speaks volumes about the potency of her performance. Beyond the immediate monetary loss, the collateral damage was immense and multifaceted. For the Bank of Oberlin, the losses were so severe that they contributed directly to its eventual failure and closure. The institution simply could not absorb the financial shock of having loaned out such a huge portion of its capital against a worthless piece of paper. This wasn't an abstract corporate collapse. It had real human consequences. Depositors, many of them ordinary citizens and local businesses, saw their savings vanish or become entangled in lengthy legal proceedings. The bank's president, Herbert Newton, who had initially been the one to expose her, saw his career and reputation irrevocably tarnished, his professional judgment called into question for the rest of his life. The shockwaves even extended to Dr. Chadwick's own bank, where the massive, unsecured loans he had either facilitated or failed to prevent led to a swift and total collapse of his professional credibility, forcing him into financial ruin. The impact, however, rippled far beyond the balance sheets of the directly defrauded banks. The entire regional banking system in the Northeast and Midwest was gripped by a contagion of fear and suspicion. In the aftermath of the scandal, banks suddenly became intensely wary of lending to women, especially those without a male cosigner or an impeccably documented financial history. Credit, the lifeblood of commerce and personal ambition, tightened considerably. The Chadwick case became a cautionary tale cited in boardrooms, a stark reminder of the dangers of letting social standing override financial prudence. It forced a widespread, if belated, reckoning within the industry, leading to stricter internal protocols for verifying collateral and a new, heightened skepticism toward even the most glamorous and well-connected clients. Cassie Chadwick's legacy, therefore, was not just the millions she stole, but the profound and lasting damage she inflicted on the culture of trust that had once allowed the Gilded Age's economy to flourish so spectacularly. The Chadwick scandal did more than just empty bank vaults. It forced a moment of painful and very public self-examination upon the entire American banking industry. For decades, the system had operated on a foundation of personal trust and social standing, a gentleman's agreement where a man's word and his place in the community were often considered sufficient collateral. Cassie Chadwick's spectacular success exposed this as a dangerous anachronism, a gaping hole in the financial defenses large enough for a determined con artist to drive a carriage through. The immediate aftermath saw a wave of panic and recrimination, but the more lasting impact was a slow, systemic shift in how banks assessed risk and verified the identities of their most prominent clients. The era of taking a client's story at face value was abruptly over. One of the most glaring vulnerabilities the scandal exposed was the almost complete absence of standardized cross-institutional communication. Cassie's entire scheme relied on banks operating in silos, each one viewing her as a unique, prized client without knowing she was simultaneously leveraging the same fictional collateral at a dozen other institutions. In the wake of her exposure, the industry recognized this fatal flaw. While a formal nationwide credit bureau was still years away, informal networks between bank presidents and managers in major cities like New York, Boston, and Cleveland became much more active. Discreet telephone calls and telegrams inquiring about a potential client's existing liabilities became a new, crucial step in the lending process for large sums. The goal was to prevent the very domino effect she had engineered, where a loan from Bank A was used to create a false track record of reliability to secure a larger loan from Bank B. Banks began to understand that a client's creditworthiness wasn't just about their assets, but about their entire interconnected web of debt. This new caution had a profound, and for many, a deeply unfair consequence: a dramatic tightening of credit for women. In the patriarchal world of Gilded Age finance, women were already viewed as financial dependents. The Chadwick case provided a seemingly perfect justification for this prejudice. Bankers, now terrified of being fooled by another charismatic woman with a tall tale, erected new, often invisible barriers. A woman seeking a significant loan, even with her own legitimate assets, now faced a level of scrutiny that was far more intense than what was applied to a man of similar means. She was frequently required to have a male relative or husband co-sign, and her personal story was subjected to a skepticism that bordered on hostility. Cassie Chadwick's actions, in a cruel twist of irony, made it exponentially more difficult for generations of legitimate businesswomen and female heirs to access the capital they needed, reinforcing the very gender inequalities she had so brilliantly exploited. Internally, banks began to implement more rigorous verification protocols, particularly for loans backed by securities from private individuals or corporations. The Chadwick case became a textbook example used in training. The question, "Have we independently verified this collateral?" became a mandatory box to check. A promissory note from a famous industrialist would no longer be accepted on its face. A bank officer would now be expected to pick up the telephone or send a registered letter directly to that individual's corporate offices for confirmation. This seems like an elementary step today, but for an industry built on personal relationships and social cues, it represented a fundamental cultural shift. The burden of proof was formally transferred from the borrower to the lender, transforming banking from a club based on reputation into a profession grounded in documented fact. While the scandal did not immediately trigger sweeping federal banking legislation, that would come later with the Panic of 1907 and the eventual creation of the Federal Reserve. It did act as a powerful catalyst for internal reform. Bank boards of directors, horrified by the losses suffered by their institutions, demanded stricter internal controls and more frequent surprise audits. The role of the internal auditor was elevated from a bookkeeping function to a crucial line of defense against fraud. These auditors were now tasked with looking for the specific patterns Cassie had used: circular payments between accounts at different banks, a lack of diverse assets, and an over-reliance on a single, difficult-to-verify piece of collateral. Her methods became a case study in what to look for and in catching the next great swindler before they could cause irreparable harm. The ghost of Cassie Chadwick, the woman who fooled them all, now haunted the hallways of every major bank, a permanent and sobering reminder that in the world of high finance, trust is not a strategy. It is a vulnerability that must be guarded with relentless diligence and verified fact. The relentless grind of prison life proved too much for a spirit built on fantasy and freedom. Cassie Chadwick, the woman who had lived a decade-long lie of spectacular proportions, died not in a palace on Euclid Avenue, but within the stark, oppressive walls of the Ohio State Penitentiary. Her death came on October 10, 1907, a mere 4 years into her 10-year sentence. The official cause was listed as anemia and general physical decline, but those who had followed her story understood it was more than that. It was a final, definitive surrender. The brilliant, defiant will that had orchestrated one of America's greatest cons had been systematically broken by the monotonous reality of incarceration, the loss of her identity, and the crushing weight of her exposed fiction. Her body, once adorned in the finest silks, was claimed by her estranged son, Emil Hoover, from her first marriage. In a final, quiet act that contrasted sharply with her life's grand drama, she was buried in an unassuming grave in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery, her headstone bearing the name she was born with, Elizabeth Bigley. The Queen of Ohio was laid to rest not as a celebrity or a criminal mastermind, but simply as a mother, her tumultuous journey ending not with a bang, but with a whisper. Cassie Chadwick's legacy, however, refused to be buried with her. She endures in the annals of American history not merely as a successful swindler, but as a singular symbol of the Gilded Age itself, a human embodiment of its contradictions, its ambitions, and its deep-seated hypocrisies. Her story is a masterclass in the art of the con, a case study in how perception can be meticulously engineered to override reality. She demonstrated that the most valuable currency isn't always gold. Sometimes it's a well-told story delivered with unshakable confidence to an audience desperate to believe it. Her techniques forging a powerful narrative leveraging social proof, exploiting systemic greed, and creating a self-perpetuating cycle of credibility are still studied today not just by historians of crime, but by marketers, psychologists, and sociologists seeking to understand the mechanics of influence and deception. Her saga holds up a stark mirror to the era's glittering facade, revealing the profound vulnerabilities that lay beneath the surface of its powerful institutions. The fact that a woman with a checkered past and a forged piece of paper could systematically plunder the vaults of America's most prestigious banks speaks volumes about a financial system that prioritized social connections and the appearance of wealth over diligent verification. The bankers were not just her victims, they were her unwitting accomplices, their own ambition and fear of missing out blinding them to the most elementary principles of their profession. Cassie's con worked because she understood the male ego of the Gilded Age better than the men themselves. She knew that their desire for prestige and their terror of being outmaneuvered by a rival were weaknesses far more exploitable than any vault door. In many ways, Cassie Chadwick was a perverse folk hero for her time. To the ordinary person reading about her exploits in the newspaper, she was a thrilling figure of rebellion. In an age of vast inequality and seemingly untouchable industrial titans, she had the audacity to turn the system's own rules against its most powerful gatekeepers. She represented a fantasy of the little person striking back, using wit and charm to extract millions from the very men who controlled the nation's wealth. While her methods were criminal, the public's fascination with her revealed a deep-seated resentment of the ruling class and a secret admiration for anyone who could expose its arrogance and gullibility. Ultimately, the story of Cassie Chadwick is a timeless human parable about the seductive power of illusion and the universal desire to believe in a more glamorous, more exciting reality. She tapped into something fundamental in the human psyche, the longing for connection to greatness, the thrill of being an insider to a secret, and the powerful allure of a fortune that seems just within reach. Her legacy is a permanent caution, a reminder that the most dangerous lies are not those we are told, but those we are all too eager to tell ourselves. She proved that the most spectacular deceptions are not built on complex technology, but on a simple, profound understanding of what people truly want and the courage or the audacity to promise it to them. To fully appreciate the uniqueness of Cassie Chadwick's deception, we must place her story alongside those of other women navigating the treacherous waters of Gilded Age wealth. This was an era where a woman's social and financial standing was almost entirely dictated by the men in her life, her father, and then her husband. For legitimate heiresses like Consuelo Vanderbilt, immense fortune was not a gateway to freedom, but a key to a gilded cage. Consuelo's story is one of heartbreaking coercion. Her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, famously forced her into a marriage with the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a union designed to trade American new money for British aristocratic title. Consuelo was the quintessential dollar princess, a young woman whose personal happiness was sacrificed on the altar of social climbing. Her vast wealth used to refurbish the dilapidated Blenheim Palace, while she endured a profoundly unhappy marriage. Her life, though draped in silks and titles, was a testament to the fact that even the most legitimate fortune could not buy a woman autonomy in a society that viewed her as a vessel for wealth and a bearer of heirs. Cassie Chadwick operated as a dark, twisted mirror image of this narrative. While Consuelo Vanderbilt had her real fortune leveraged for a fake title, Cassie invented a fake fortune to access real power and influence. She saw the system for what it was, a rigged game where a woman's value was transactional, and decided to write her own rules. The dollar princess narrative required a woman to be a passive object in a financial exchange, but Cassie became the active architect of her own destiny, however criminal it may have been. She bypassed the need for a willing father or a titled husband altogether, creating her own mythical patriarch in Andrew Carnegie, and using that fiction to deal directly with the male power brokers of finance. Where Consuelo was trapped by her very real money, Cassie was liberated by her completely fictional fortune, a perverse form of empowerment that allowed her to move through the highest levels of society with an audacity no properly bred heiress would ever dare to display. She was not, of course, the only woman of the era to turn to fraud. Another fascinating figure for comparison is the so-called Baroness of Arizona, Sarah Winchester, though her story is shrouded in more mystery and less outright criminal intent. More directly comparable are other female imposters like the enigmatic Princess Caribou, who predated the Gilded Age but captured a similar public fascination with an exotic, fabricated identity. What set Cassie apart from these other frauds was the sheer scale of her ambition and the specific, financial nature of her target. She wasn't pretending to be a displaced royal to gain shelter and admiration. She was impersonating the heir to the world's greatest industrial fortune to systematically loot the institutions that powered the American economy. Her con required a deep, intuitive understanding of high finance, a world almost entirely closed to women. She didn't just want to be admired, she wanted to command, to spend, and to wield the kind of economic power that was, in reality, the exclusive domain of men like Carnegie and Rockefeller. This highlights the unique pressures and limited opportunities for women seeking to escape their circumstances in the late 19th century. For a woman born into poverty like Elizabeth Bigley, the conventional paths to security were grim: a life of domestic drudgery, factory work, or a marriage of mere convenience. The glittering world of the elite was a fortress, and the only legitimate keys were birth or marriage. Cassie, possessing immense intelligence and ambition, but lacking either key, decided to pick the lock. Her method was a brilliant, if criminal, exploitation of the era's deepest contradictions. The Gilded Age worshipped wealth above all else, yet was intensely snobbish about its origins. It celebrated self-made men, but looked down on self-made women. Cassie exposed the hypocrisy by demonstrating that if the appearance of old money was all that was required for entry, then that appearance could be manufactured. Her entire scheme was a performance that held a mirror up to society, revealing that their reverence for pedigree was so profound it could be satisfied with a convincing forgery. In the end, the stories of Consuelo Vanderbilt and Cassie Chadwick represent two sides of the same gilded coin. One was a prisoner of her authentic fortune, the other a fugitive empowered by her fabricated one. Both were products of a system that commodified women, but where Consuelo submitted to its brutal logic, Cassie weaponized it. She took the same desires that fueled the dollar princess, trade, the hunger for status, the obsession with names, the blurring of lineage and liquidity, and channeled them into a personal enterprise of breathtaking daring. Her legacy, when viewed through this comparative lens, is not just that of a master swindler, but of a dark alchemist who understood the base elements of Gilded Age society, vanity, greed, and social climbing, and transmuted them for a few glorious years into a fortune built entirely on air. To truly understand a figure like Cassie Chadwick, we must look beyond the forged documents and stolen money and into the intricate psychological makeup that enables such a grand deception to flourish. The successful con artist is not merely a liar. They are a psychological architect, building an alternative reality so compelling that others willingly move in and furnish it with their own trust and capital. At the core of this personality lies a potent and often contradictory blend of traits, a mental toolkit that includes superficial charm, a profound sense of narcissism, a compulsive relationship with falsehood, and a chilling lack of empathetic connection. Cassie didn't just tell a lie. She wove a tapestry of deception where every thread was a calculated manipulation of human emotion and expectation. Consider the weaponized charm she deployed. This wasn't simple friendliness or polite conversation. It was a targeted, disarming charisma designed to bypass skepticism and forge an instant, illusory intimacy. When she spoke to a banker, she wasn't just presenting a business proposition. She was making him feel seen, important, and uniquely chosen to be her confidant. This charm was her primary tool for building rapport, a social lubricant that made the outrageous seem plausible. It allowed her to frame her requests not as desperate pleas for cash, but as exclusive opportunities for the banker to join her inner circle. This ability to project warmth and confidence is a hallmark of the grifter's art, a performance that convinces the target they are dealing with a friend, not a predator, effectively lowering their defensive guards before the real manipulation even begins. Beneath this veneer of charm often resides a deep-seated narcissism, a trait Cassie exhibited in spades. The narcissistic con artist possesses an unshakable, grandiose belief in their own superiority and entitlement. They feel the normal rules of society simply do not apply to them. Cassie's decision to impersonate the daughter of the world's richest man wasn't just a pragmatic choice. It was a reflection of her own inflated self-image. She believed she deserved that level of wealth and status, that she was clever enough to pull off the impersonation, and that the people she was deceiving were ultimately lesser, tools to be used for her own gratification. This narcissistic fuel is what allows a con artist to maintain their composure under intense pressure. They are not tormented by guilt, but are instead energized by the thrill of controlling the narrative and outsmarting their so-called superiors. This leads us to the engine of the deception, pathological lying. For most people, a lie is a discrete event, a deviation from the truth often accompanied by anxiety. For the pathological liar like Cassie, falsehood is the native language. Lying is not a means to an end. It is an end in itself, a compulsive and self-reinforcing behavior. Her entire existence became a layered narrative, from the overarching Carnegie myth down to the smallest details of her daily life. What's fascinating is how she used these lies not just to deceive, but to create a resonant human story. Her tales of a loving but distant father, of hidden sorrow and burdened wealth, were crafted to elicit specific emotional responses: pity, protectiveness, and a sense of shared secret keeping. The lie became a living, evolving entity that she nurtured and adapted, not because it was easy, but because it was essential to her identity. Her behavior under duress offers a masterclass in this deceptive psychology. When confronted by the lawyer demanding repayment, she didn't crumble or confess. Instead, she pivoted instantly to a performance of wounded outrage and unassailable confidence. This ability to think on her feet and double down on the fiction, even when faced with direct confrontation, points to a phenomenal lack of empathy. She could not genuinely comprehend or care about the financial ruin and personal humiliation she was inflicting on her victims. Their pain was an abstraction, an inconvenient consequence of her play. This emotional detachment is the grifter's shield. It allows them to look their target in the eye, absorb their fears and hopes, and then coolly manipulate those very emotions to tighten the trap, all without a flicker of the conscience that would paralyze most people. Ultimately, the psychology of the con artist like Cassie Chadwick is a stark lesson in the power of narrative over fact. She understood that people are not always rational actors. They are emotional beings who crave compelling stories. She didn't defeat the banking system by hacking its computers or cracking its vaults. She defeated it by hacking the human brain, by identifying the deep-seated desires for status, connection, and wealth that clouded the judgment of even the most cautious men. Her mind was a factory of realities, and for a glorious, devastatingly brief period, she succeeded in selling her carefully crafted fantasy to a world that was all too eager to buy. Cassie Chadwick's story was far too sensational to fade away with her death. Even before her trial concluded, the public's insatiable appetite for her saga was being fed directly by the very newspapers that had covered her downfall. Major publications, understanding they had a circulation gold mine on their hands, often repackaged the daily court reports into dramatic multi-part serials, running under headlines that framed her life as a thrilling melodrama. These weren't just dry recitations of fact. They were narratives filled with imagined dialogue, descriptions of her emotional state, and speculative asides about her mysterious past, effectively turning real-life events into the kind of gripping fiction readers might otherwise have purchased in a dime novel. The press, having created the celebrity of the Queen of Ohio, now had a vested interest in prolonging her fame, ensuring that her story was told and retold in a way that maximized public engagement and, of course, newspaper sales. This early media frenzy laid the foundation for her enduring place in American true crime lore. In the decades following her death, authors and historians began to sift through the sensational headlines to piece together a more nuanced account. Books began to appear, with titles that played on her most famous deception, analyzing not just the mechanics of her fraud, but the social context that made it possible. These works transitioned her from a fleeting newspaper sensation into a permanent subject of historical study. Her story proved irresistible to writers exploring the Gilded Age, as it served as a perfect case study to illustrate the era's overarching themes: the vast chasm between rich and poor, the performative nature of high society, and the profound vulnerabilities of a newly powerful financial system. She became a character who could symbolize the entire period, her personal audacity reflecting the boundless ambition of the age itself. The natural dramatic structure of her life has perpetually beckoned filmmakers and television producers. The narrative possesses all the essential elements of a captivating screenplay: a compelling anti-hero, a high-stakes, victimless feeling crime, a glittering setting, and a spectacular downfall. While a definitive major motion picture about Cassie Chadwick has yet to be made, her story has influenced countless fictionalized portrayals of cunning female grifters. You can see echoes of her methods in characters who use their intelligence and charm to navigate male-dominated worlds, exploiting the vanity and greed of powerful men to achieve their own ends. The long-standing interest in adapting her life points to a recognition that her tale is about more than just crime. It's a classic, almost Shakespearean story of ambition, identity, and the tragic cost of living a lie. So why does this particular brand of crime, now over a century old, continue to resonate so deeply with modern audiences? The answer lies in the timeless and universal elements of her deception. At its core, Cassie's story is a masterclass in the art of storytelling itself. She understood that a powerful narrative can be more convincing than any fact, a concept that feels incredibly relevant in our modern world of social media influence and curated online personas. In an age where people can build entire careers or amass vast followings based on a perceived, rather than a real, expertise or lifestyle, Cassie Chadwick looks less like a historical anomaly and more like a pioneer. She was crafting her personal brand long before the term existed, using every tool at her disposal to manage her public image and control her narrative. Furthermore, her saga taps into an enduring cultural fascination with class mobility and the underdog. Cassie was a woman born with nothing who used her wits to crash the most exclusive party in America. There is a certain dark thrill in watching someone so systematically dismantle the barriers of an elitist system from the inside. She represents a fantasy of agency and self-invention, however flawed and illegal her methods were. Modern audiences, particularly in a culture that often celebrates the self-made individual, can't help but feel a twinge of illicit admiration for her sheer nerve. She didn't wait for permission or for a man to give her a leg up. She took what she wanted by force of personality, making her a strangely empowering, if deeply problematic, figure. Her continued relevance is also cemented by the sheer psychological intrigue of her character. She forces us to ask difficult questions about the nature of identity and belief. To what extent did she become the character she created? Was there a point where the line between Elizabeth Bigley and the Carnegie heiress truly blurred in her own mind? Her unwavering performance, even under oath and in the face of overwhelming evidence, suggests a level of commitment that transcends simple lying and ventures into a more complex psychological territory. This makes her a far more compelling subject than a common thief. She is a psychological puzzle, a study in how far a person can go to rewrite their own reality and how desperately others can want to believe in the fiction. Her story endures because it is, ultimately, a human story, a thrilling, cautionary, and endlessly fascinating exploration of the lies we tell others, and perhaps more importantly, the lies we tell ourselves. It's tempting to view Cassie Chadwick as a singular creature of her time, a flamboyant anomaly from a bygone era of corsets and calling cards. Yet, if we listen closely, the echoes of her particular genius reverberate through the courtrooms and headlines of our own century. The fundamental playbook of the high society swindler exploiting systemic trust, leveraging social ambition, and crafting a narrative so compelling it overrides rational scrutiny, hasn't been retired. It has simply been updated with modern technology and new forms of currency, both financial and social. When we examine contemporary fraudsters, we find not copies, but kindred spirits operating on the same psychological principles that Cassie mastered over 100 years ago. Consider the case of Anna Delvey, the pseudonym of Anna Sorokin, who in the 2010s convinced New York's elite that she was a German heiress with a $60 million trust fund. The parallels are almost uncanny. Like Cassie, Anna didn't just claim wealth. She performed it with meticulous, immersive detail. She stayed in 5-star hotels, wore designer clothes, and tipped lavishly, all while cultivating an air of entitled mystery about the source of her fortune. Her power lay in her ability to make the extravagant seem mundane, to normalize a lifestyle of such excess that her targets hoteliers, private jet companies, and wealthy friends found it easier to believe in her fictional wealth than to question it. Both women understood that in worlds driven by status, the appearance of having unlimited resources is often indistinguishable from actually having them. They weaponized the same social anxiety, the fear of being the one person who didn't recognize a VIP, of committing a fatal social faux pas by asking for a credit card up front from someone who clearly belonged. The psychological mechanisms these fraudsters exploit are timeless because they target the same human vulnerabilities. Both Cassie and Anna, as well as figures like the Fyre Festival's Billy McFarland, mastered the art of social proof. Cassie had the respected wives of Cleveland. Anna had a carefully curated Instagram feed and a network of influential friends who vouched for her by association. This creates a powerful buffer against skepticism. If all these other people believe she's legitimate, the thinking goes, then surely she must be. This external validation short-circuits individual due diligence. Furthermore, they both leverage the potent force of aspirational identity. Cassie's bankers didn't just want to make a loan. They wanted to be connected to the Carnegie empire. Anna's victims didn't just want to be paid back. They wanted to be part of her cool, jet-setting world. The con artist doesn't just sell a lie, they sell an identity, a chance to be on the inside of an exclusive circle. And that is a product people are willing to pay for with their money and their critical thinking. Yet, the evolution of the con also reveals fascinating shifts in its targets and methods. Cassie Chadwick's primary mark was the established, male-dominated financial institution. Her deception was a direct assault on the banking system itself, using a forged physical document as her primary weapon. A modern counterpart like Bernie Madoff, while operating on a vastly different scale, shared this institutional focus, but his weapon was digital trust and mathematical illusion. He exploited the systemic faith in a complex financial system, creating a phantom returns engine that was, in its own way, as fictional as Cassie's promissory note. Both relied on a facade of impeccable reputation and exclusivity to disarm the very checks and balances designed to prevent such frauds. In contrast, figures like Anna Delvey or the fraudulent wellness entrepreneur Belle Gibson often targeted a more diffuse ecosystem of luxury services and individual influencers. Their bank was the entire economy of aspiration, high-end hotels, fashion houses, and social media platforms. Their collateral was not a forged note, but a forged lifestyle, broadcast in real time. This highlights a cultural shift from the Gilded Age's worship of industrial capital to our own era's reverence for influencer capital and experiential wealth. The modern grifter understands that access and aesthetic can be monetized just as effectively as a line of credit, and that a compelling Instagram story can be more convincing than a paper document in a locked trunk. What truly binds these deceivers across the centuries, however, is their masterful use of narrative. Cassie Chadwick told a story of hidden lineage and gilded sorrow. Anna Delvey wove a tale of European sophistication and impatient inheritance. Bernie Madoff sold a story of consistent, improbable genius. In each case, the narrative was not merely a supporting detail. It was the core of the scheme. A good story engages the emotions, and emotions have a notorious ability to override logic. It makes the target an accomplice in the fantasy, someone who is rooting for the story to be true because it's more exciting, more glamorous, or more profitable than the mundane reality. The con artist's greatest skill is in making their target want to believe, turning skepticism into a form of cynicism that polite society is often reluctant to display. Ultimately, the enduring lesson from Cassie Chadwick to the present day is a sobering one about the architecture of trust in any society. These schemes succeed not because the systems are technically weak, but because they are psychologically porous. They expose the gaps where human desire for status, for connection, for a shortcut to the elite overpowers institutional protocol. The tools change, the settings update, but the fundamental con remains the same, a mirror held up to our own ambitions, reflecting back a version of reality we are all too eager to accept. The most effective fraudsters don't break the system's rules. They simply understand that the most important rules are the unwritten ones, governed by social vanity and the timeless, powerful yearning to be close to what we perceive as greatness. And so we reach the final dramatic act in the life of Cassie Chadwick, a journey that stretches from the humble obscurity of a Canadian farmhouse to the gilded prison of her own magnificent creation. Her story is a breathtaking arc of pure, unadulterated audacity, a testament to how a single, powerful lie, told with enough conviction, can momentarily eclipse reality itself. She took the raw materials of her own desperation and, through sheer force of will and psychological insight, forged them into a key that unlocked the vaults of the most powerful men in America. From Elizabeth Bigley, the small-time forger, to Cassie Chadwick, the dazzling queen of high society, her life was a performance of such scale and daring that it continues to captivate us more than a century later. It's a narrative that holds within it the very essence of the Gilded Age, the shimmering surface of wealth, and the profound moral rot that often festered just beneath. The enduring power of her story lies not in the money she stole, but in the timeless themes it exposes. At its heart is the intoxicating, often corrosive, allure of wealth and the status it confers. Cassie understood that in a society obsessed with lineage and lucre, the appearance of old money could be more valuable than its actual possession. She held up a mirror to the elite, reflecting back their own snobbery and desire for exclusivity. and they lavished her with loans for the privilege of gazing into it. This speaks directly to the profound fragility of trust, especially when it intersects with greed. The bankers she deceived were not fools in the conventional sense. They were experts in risk assessment who abandoned their own principles because the potential reward, a connection to the Carnegie empire, was a siren song too alluring to resist. They wanted so desperately to believe her story that they became active participants in their own deception, proving that the most secure systems in the world are vulnerable when they are manned by human beings with human desires. Ultimately, Cassie Chadwick stands as a dark monument to the power of the individual to challenge a rigid system. She was a woman with no formal power, no birthright, and no legitimate path to the world she craved. So she carved her own path with cunning, charm, and a forged piece of paper. Her rebellion was criminal, but it was also a stunning act of agency against a society that offered her few alternatives. She exposed the hypocrisies of her time, demonstrating that the gatekeepers of capital were as susceptible to flattery and fantasy as anyone else. Her legacy is a permanent question mark scribbled in the margins of history, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about ambition, identity, and the lengths to which people will go to rewrite their own destinies. This brings us to a final, provocative thought, one that bridges the gap between her gaslit era and our digitally illuminated present. In an age defined by curated online profiles, influencer culture, and financial transactions that happen at the speed of light, could a Cassie Chadwick happen again? The tools of deception have undoubtedly evolved. Today, she might not need a forged promissory note, a carefully doctored screenshot of a crypto wallet, a fabricated email from a venture capital firm, or a brilliantly manipulated social media feed could serve the same purpose. She could build a global brand of illusion from a laptop, using the same psychological principles of social proof and aspirational identity to attract investors and sycophants. The stage has changed, but the fundamental script of the con, the compelling narrative, the manufactured credibility, the exploitation of greed remains eerily similar. Yet the more pressing question is not could it happen, but would we be any less susceptible? We live in a world where perception is often mistaken for reality, where a large following is equated with expertise, and where the pressure to keep up with a digitally enhanced version of success is immense. In many ways, the modern landscape of social media and online finance might make us even more vulnerable. We are conditioned to make swift judgments based on curated visuals and viral stories, often without the time or tools for deep verification. The desire to be on the inside of the next big thing, to be associated with a rising star or a revolutionary idea, is a powerful intoxicant, one that can cloud judgment as effectively today as it did in a Cleveland banker's office in 1902. Cassie Chadwick's story, therefore, is not just a fascinating relic of the past. It is a timeless mirror, reflecting our own perpetual struggle to discern the authentic from the artificial, and a sobering reminder that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we are most desperate to believe.